This is a 2009 Intel Mac Mini. Originally it shipped with macOS X's Leopard, but today we're going to try something a little unusual. Instead of macOS, we're going to install Haiku, the modern open source re-implementation of BeOS. Right now, I'm repartitioning the hard drive to make room for Haiku. And if everything goes according to plan... I love old computers, I love to collect them, I love to fix them. I'm the vintage collector and these are my stories. My first attempt was to boot Haiku from a CD-ROM. I used the 32-bit AnyBoot image, burned it to a CD and tried to boot it on the Mac Mini. But no matter what I did, I always ended up here, just a blank screen. No error message, no progress, nothing. Thinking this might be an issue with the Mac's built-in EFI bootloader, I went back into macOS X and installed Refit, hoping to get better control over the boot process. And it did give me additional boot options for performing a legacy boot. But in the end, every single one of them failed. The only real clue I got was this error indicating that the boot IA32.EFI loader could not be started. Now that's well explainable, as the early 2009 Mac Mini has a 64-bit EFI. And a 64-bit EFI cannot run 32-bit EFI binaries. As a result, the system cannot boot Haiku directly through EFI. In theory, this should still work by starting a 32-bit OS through the legacy BIOS compatibility layer, the so-called CSM. But as you just saw before, while the Apple bootloader did detect the Haiku boot CD-ROM, even though it called it Windows, it was still unable to start it. Also, choosing the legacy boot options from Refit, which is actually calling Apple CSM mode, wasn't working. The 64-bit version progressed further, but ultimately ended in a kernel panic. Knowing Refit was unmaintained for many years, I wanted to exclude the possibility of a bootloader issue. So I replaced it with Refind, a modern fork of Refit. Plus I transferred the boot image to a USB key as an alternate boot medium. But again, no luck here. Pity, as I specifically wanted the 32-bit version. It's the only way to demonstrate Haiku's binary compatibility with classic BeOS applications on real hardware outside of emulation. Using Refind, I tried the 64-bit version again, but observed the same crash. However, this was with Haiku R1 Beta 5, which dates back to September 2024, so it might well be a bug of some sort. Hence I decided to fetch some nightly builds of Haiku and continue from there. That said, no success again with the 32-bit version, but the 64-bit version did boot successfully and ran through the install. From there, I went back to OS X, creating another partition and naming it Haiku 32. My idea was to rerun the OS installer from the installed 64-bit Haiku system, pointing it to the Haiku 32-bit install medium and the Haiku 32 target partition. But not so fast. The moment I wanted to boot back into Haiku, I noticed that the boot options wouldn't work. Only the Haiku 64-bit carried an installed OS at this point. Still, it was detected as a legacy OS, so the CSM BIOS compatibility mode would be invoked to boot it, which of course did not lead anywhere. Now, this doesn't make much sense, as 64-bit Haiku can absolutely be booted from EFI. But after some reading, I found that the EFI bootloader is not installed to the EFI partition by default. Luckily, the USB key carries a fallback loader, and selecting this and jamming the spacebar right away to bring up the Haiku boot options allowed me to select the Haiku 64 partition to boot from. Using this workaround, I could boot from the hard drive. For a permanent solution, you need to manually mount the EFI partition from the disk setup utility and then copy Haiku loader.efi to /efi/boot as boot x64.efi. I did the same for the boot IA32.efi loader as well, even knowing it wouldn't work. The only reason I'm showing this is in the context of Refine's automatic loader detection mechanism. Because once back in Refine, we'll notice how the so-called fallback bootloader now appears, which corresponds to the boot x64.efi loader, and the icon gives it away that this loader resides on the hard drive and not on the USB key. And you'll notice that there's no extra entry for the 32-bit boot IA32.efi loader appearing for the simple reason, as stated before, it's not compatible with the 64-bit EFI. That said, I then went back to Haiku 64, trying out my idea to install the 32-bit version of Haiku from there. Much to my surprise, the 64-bit installer would actually install the 32-bit version without any complaints. I didn't expect that to work, to be honest. But would it boot? First, I tried the obvious, running the EFI bootloader, again pressing the spacebar to bring up the boot menu, then switching the boot volume from the Haiku 64 to the Haiku 32 partition. But that wouldn't work. So I wanted to try the BeOS compatibility mode, aka legacy boot, but here as well, no success. Further investigation then pointed me into the direction of how Apple treats CSM mode, especially when running Windows via Boot Camp. And for that to work, the hard disk must be partitioned with hybrid GPT and MBR partition tables. As I did the partitions from macOS X's disk utility, it didn't create the MBR partition table automatically. This would normally only happen when using Boot Camp to set up a Windows dual boot system. So I tried booting Linux System Rescue, but that one tripped into a graphics related issue itself and stalled during startup. Booting with the No Mode Set option worked though, bringing me to the system console. From here I inspected the hard disk, noticing it carried only a GPT partition table. Using the gdisk utility, you can convert a GPT-only partition table to a GPT plus MBR hybrid, and that's what I did here. As a word of caution, please take a backup unless you have no fear of losing everything. Then I tried once more to boot into Haiku 32, hoping the MBR partition would trick Apple's EFI to start up in CSM mode. But, nope. That's where I decided to give up on it, at least on this machine. Other users had better success with earlier Intel Macs from around 2006, which still had used the 32-bit EFI. Those are said to have no issues booting Haiku 32, whereas later models like my Mac Mini 3.1 are known to be problematic. As noted in my previous episode, running application binaries originally compiled for BeOS on Haiku was one of the project's major design goals. But the 64-bit version breaks this compatibility design goal for apparent reasons, and without a working 32-bit install, I can't demo this today. But fear not, we'll take a closer look at this again in a follow-up episode. For now, I moved on to reconfiguring refind. First, I enabled mouse support in refind.conf. Then I updated the scan volume setting to exclude the Haiku 64 partition. I also relocated the Haiku EFI loader to /EFI/Haiku. Back in Refind, the fallback loader now appears simply as Haiku. I didn't hide the Haiku 32 partition, even though it's not bootable at this point, just so I can revisit this later, as I'm definitely not done with it yet. Now, at least Haiku 64 was fully installed and ready to run, so I wanted to see what works and what doesn't. Our famous teapot spins like crazy at more than decent frame rates, even with other parallel tasks running concurrently. And if anything, this is in true tradition of what we saw some 30 years prior in the mid-90s when BEnc first demoed BeOS on the B-Box. Now, we'll have a closer look at applications in another episode, but naturally I wanted to try some games like Sauerbraten. But not only was the frame rate absolutely terrible, which is due to missing hardware acceleration, I also didn't get any sound. What a pity, as it would have been nice to repeat the music playback demo from the previous B-Box episode. And that's especially unfortunate, because audio was always a big part of the BeOS story. In fact, several B employees were musicians themselves, and BeOS was designed with multimedia in mind from the very beginning. There was a formation called the Cotton Squares, whose songs were even included as samples with the original BeOS. Now, there's several approaches to try for getting working audio. One rather obscure one, especially since the audio device was already shown in the media control panel, was to boot into OS X first. This is said to initialize the sound device, so it should work after rebooting into Haiku. This trick still didn't do it for me. Another option was to disable all audio drivers and install Open Sound. However, this was yet another dead end. And finally, I tried my admittedly super cheap USB sound sticks. However, only one of the two, for a very brief moment, emitted some sound, although with lots of stuttering. But then it eventually stopped working altogether, and I couldn't make it play audio ever again, even after numerous reboots. Some sources even recommend setting the spoof OS X version variable in refind.conf. This should cause the firmware to initialize the hardware differently, and is probably somewhat similar in effect, like actually booting into OS X first and then performing a warm reboot. Except not for me. Anyway, no hard feelings here for all these detours and holdups, as Haiku is still in beta. Your mileage on Intel Macs may vary, with most issues usually revolving around missing 3D acceleration, malfunctioning audio and Wi-Fi. But even so, in best tradition of BeOS running on PowerMacs 30 years ago, you can still get its spiritual successor Haiku running, at least to some degree, on Intel Macs. And that alone is already pretty amazing. However, we haven't yet been looking into the application ecosystem, neither for the original BeOS back then, nor Haiku today. But that's a story for another time. If you've ever tried Haiku on real hardware, especially on older Macs, I'd really be curious to hear about your experience. And who knows, maybe we'll find the perfect Mac, or even the hidden magic trick for the 32-bit version after all. I'm the Vintage Collector, and this was my story for today. Thanks for watching, and see you again next Sunday.